Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the In Full Bloom Book Club. Here we utilize the transformative power of storytelling to explore perspectives and to cultivate empathy, compassion, and connection. Our theme for this season is collective grief and trauma. We'll be exploring the questions: how does trauma shape us? What consequences of collective trauma are we facing today? And how can we support one another in navigating collective grief? So this is our book intro number 2, and we're about to dive into the Light Movie, A Year in the Life of a New York City Paramedic by Anthony Almojera. If you'd like to read along and join the discussion, physical and digital book purchase options are in the description box below. So today we'll be giving our first impressions of the book and the topics it will cover. We'll be reflecting on our own understandings and misunderstandings, experiences, biases, etc., in anticipation of the ways that this narrative will provide us an expanded perspective. So, the beginning of every episode, we do a quote of the day, and today is my day to provide a quote. So the quote I chose for today is a quote by, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Jaime Gil de Biedma. And the quote is, "I believe that I want to be a poet, but deep down I just want it to be a poem." This quote really resonates with me as like someone in the creative space, or someone who considers themselves like a creative or an artist at heart, and kind of the way I think and the way I interact with the world. I think in some ways, art is like cathartic, but in some ways I think it's almost like trying to make meaning and purpose out of the experiences, the triumphs, the challenges, trying to make meaning out of all of that in our life. And in some ways, like obviously the creation of the art itself hopefully is intrinsically enjoyable, but I also think there's some wisdom to the fact that we're trying to express the depth, the richness of our experience in a way that feels beautiful, and leave kind of our stamp on the world. And so I just thought that was, I don't actually know the context of the poem, so this may be way off from what the individual meant to suggest, but that's kind of just how I perceived and how it moved me.
All right, so before we go ahead and jump into our questions, we're going to go ahead and read the synopsis. So the synopsis reads, as a seasoned paramedic and union leader, Anthony Almojera thought he could handle anything his new job threw at him. Like many medical first responders, he came from a troubled background and carried the traumas of the city as well as its triumphs. He had grown up in the rough and tumble Park Slope of the 1980s, been homeless for a time, and had watched murder, addiction, and hopelessness consume those closest to him. But he had dedicated his life to helping people in need, and while every day was filled with tragedy, stabbings, shootings, accidents, suicides, it also brought moments of uplift. First, resuscitations and rescues that reminded Anthony and his coworkers why EMS was the most thrilling job on earth, even if the pay was lousy and the hours were long. So when a strange new virus began spreading in New York, Anthony and his fellow medics were ready. They had done the biohazard drills, they knew the procedures and how to handle the sick and bereaved. They believed that their lives and training had prepared them for this new challenge. But the months ahead would prove them wrong and would push New York's EMS workers and Anthony himself to the breaking point and beyond. Following one paramedic into hell and back, Riding the Lightning tells the story of New York City's darkest days through the eyes of its frontline medical workers and the community they serve. Ordinary people who will continue to make New York an extraordinary place long after it has been reborn from the ashes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's go ahead and jump into our first question, which is our general expectations and assumptions about the novel. What are some thoughts, feelings, and or challenges you anticipate encountering?
Well, one, I think this is obviously, this is, when we're talking about collective grief and trauma, this is especially relevant because we're now on, I don't know if we would consider this like a post-pandemic era yet. We're at a very different place than we were 2 years ago, but this has been a very transformative time. I mean, it's transformed the way we relate to each other, to one another, the way people work, like more remote work opportunities than there were prior to 2020. And I think we're very much still in a space of trying to figure out how this will affect us moving forward as not only a nation, but as a global community. Um, it is something that's impacted, again, us globally in a way that I don't know if anything else has in the 21st century. Um, so yeah, I think I'm looking forward to the opportunity of seeing things through this unique perspective as someone like on the front line. He speaks as a worker. He also speaks as just a member of the public who experienced the pandemic himself and who had like a personal response to that. Um, I mean, he was able to see firsthand also like kind of how marginalized groups were affected um, by the pandemic, and so I just think it's a very interesting view. As far as like any struggles or I guess any challenges I anticipate encountering, I think it's going to be really touching. And I may even feel kind of convicted or even a little bit of guilt at how, like, more recently, how I've not been as cautious as I was at a different period of time. And I recognize the reality is that there are still people being affected by COVID-19. And I think it's easy for me at this point in the pandemic to kind of put that out of my mind and to um, engage in a way that is more similar to how we engaged prior to 2020, and so I may kind of struggle with that. But yeah, I'm really excited for this read. I think he has an interesting perspective to speak to.
I definitely think it's going to get quite intimate and a lot of his encounters with people, and even on a personal level. Um, just from the synopsis, I can tell like it took a toll on. I mean, obviously it did. It was something no one saw coming, and it was overwhelming. And so, yeah, as we saw during the pandemic, mental health was a big. We were going through a crisis, and I can only imagine what his fellow coworkers and a lot of the people he encountered were going through. So I can definitely tell it's going to get really heavy. It almost might put us back in that place of like that initial like shock when it hit us and how serious. Because in the beginning it was kind of like, oh, it's just like the flu or something, and but then shortly after we realized this is significantly more scary than we had anticipated. And I know, speaking for myself, it almost felt like the world had stopped for a moment. It was just like, what do we do? It might be a little triggering, but I definitely think it would be really therapeutic to kind of revisit that and kind of look at it through the lens of someone else. So,
Yeah, one challenge I anticipate like encountering and reading this book is the way, like just revisiting how politicized it was. And just as a reader, I'm going to try my best to like suspend my judgment or my own feelings in order to like understand where certain characters are coming from or empathize with certain characters and certain outcomes they may face. Like, for example, like, of course, there were people who were like anti-vax, and then there were people who were saying like, no, everybody needs to get it. There were people who were saying a mask is taking away my rights. And then there are people who were saying like, everybody should wear a mask. Even if it doesn't protect you, it could protect someone you know. Like, so just being kind of thrown back into that space, I can definitely already tell you it's going to be very challenging. It becoming such a talking point rather than like we're actually facing this virus. That was very stressful. And just seeing videos going viral of, oh, I'm not wearing a mask. I can't wear a mask. I don't know. I'm really nervous about encountering that in this book and how I'm going to make sense of it. And yeah.
I think it's dope that you have like an awareness of your biases coming into it and that you're trying to be intentional about holding space for the different perspectives that may come up here. So I think
Yeah.
that's an awesome place to start.
The COVID-19 pandemic will likely go down in history as the greatest global tragedy of the first quarter of this century. As Almojera tells it, NYC paramedics were much less equipped to handle the pandemic than they originally thought. How did your perspective on the pandemic shift from the beginning of the outbreak to where we are now? From your perspective, what makes the COVID-19 pandemic unique in its impact? Feel free to speak personally or on a societal scale. I guess off the bat, one thing that could make this different from other pandemics of the past is now there we have like social media and like ways to for everybody to have their own platform, and so we were bombarded with different information. And like I was kind of saying, based on what news station you watched, you got one set of information, or who you follow on social media. And so I think in the past there was more of like a streamline of like, these are the facts, this is what you need to do. And I feel like this time around we kind of had to discern. There was a lot of liberties that we had to take, like, what do I think is best for me? This person said this, but they're telling me this. Like, it was a lot of information and misinformation to sort through.
Yeah, I mean, I briefly said that the beginning when the pandemic hit, we didn't. Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I know that a lot of people I associate myself with and didn't see it as what it is now. We didn't think it was going to be this big, and we also kind of saw like it was something that was going to blow over. And here we are, what, almost 3 years later, and still very much so. There are still COVID cases. There are still people grieving losses, like great losses. People who lost entire families because of this virus, and it's traumatic and it's so heartbreaking. Um, and so I think that's what makes this so unique. Is it just wiped through the world on such a huge scale, and it's not something that we couldn't ignore it. In the beginning we tried, but like where we are now, there's no ignoring what it was. I remember looking at the news and always seeing like the what the total it was total cases that were confirmed, and then the deaths and all that. It was just like you're just constantly hit with all these different things all the time, and it felt we just were drowning in information overload and people's opinions all the time. People were scared, and so when you're scared, you're acting out. You're not thinking about what you're saying all the time, and you're angry and you're aggressive. And it was such a really tough time to get through. So I personally, it was a really scary time, um, which I did a lot of internalizing. As an adult, you see the really dark sides of what's happening in the world, and you're like, there's nothing I can do. I have to just take this a day at a time. And that was truly the scariest time, scariest thing about it.
I think at the beginning, like you were saying, Asia, at the beginning of the outbreak, it was definitely like um, I assumed that this is something we would recover from fairly quickly. And then there was a certain point where I kind of had the shifting perspective. Like I thought we were going to be wearing for the foreseeable future, like for a few more years, we were going to be wearing masks and things like that, which we are. But I will say, like, the way I personally have, the way things have adapted to feel, like normal, is surprising to me. And I think that just speaks to the resilience and the adaptability of like the human spirit. But yeah, I think I take for granted the ease that I feel now, because it was a very anxiety provoking time. There was a constant concern of like how I move affects other people. You know what I mean? I have a grandmother, and I had a sister who was like pregnant during some of this, pregnant twice, matter of fact, throughout the course of like the pandemic era. And so there was just a lot of fear about like, how do I operate in a way that is not going to cause harm to people. And as far as what I feel like makes the COVID pandemic unique in its impact is how it affected, again, like a global community. I imagine as a society, we're still reflecting on like what this means again for us. And so it's hard to kind of answer what makes this so unique, because we're really going to continue to see the impact from here on out. You know what I mean? And the impact, like, for example, on children. Like I talk about, sometimes I have a niece who was born April of 2021. So like right at the beginning, right at the beginning of the stay-at-home orders and things like that, at least in the area that we're in. And I think that affected like her socialization and things like that. And I wonder how that's going to continue to impact her from here on out. We're about to move on to our last question. Thank you, Tribe, for staying with us this far. We're so happy to have you a part of the discussion. As a reminder, you can show your support and how much you value our content by liking, commenting, and subscribing down below. We'd so greatly appreciate it. Our last question is, Anthony and many of his colleagues came from humble and challenging beginnings. I'd imagine this is not coincidental and instead driven in part by their desire to serve their struggling communities. In your life, how, if at all, have hardships you've experienced or witnessed others experience impacted your ambitions?
So as far as like the way that I like what I'm going to school for, like I'm in school for biology, but ultimately I want to be a dermatologist, which really stems from all the skin problems I had growing up that kind of led to a little bit of bullying. Like I had really bad like eczema. And then of course, like during puberty, I had like really bad acne. I always felt like I literally took every like topical steroid, oral immune suppressant, like ever. Like I just always felt like anything there was, I tried it, any treatment. And so I kind of just always wanted to kind of like pay it forward. Um, and then also like in the field of dermatology, a lot of research is done on like white skin, and a lot of the practitioners are also not Black. So I was just felt like that's kind of like a thing that I could do, um, having firsthand experience with some of these skin conditions.
Sorry to hear that that you experienced bullying and all that as a child, but I'm glad you're
Is it
taking
cool?
that and like redirecting it in something that you want to give back and be there, almost like um, I want to step in and be someone for someone else to look up to.
I think there's so much also like there's so many opportunities to like to try to be a light spot and move with integrity in that space, because as far as like the skincare industry, I have a bone to pick, because I feel like there's so many like fads and trends, and it's so frustrating because like people like what you experienced as a kid, like you're trying to you know improve your quality of life through these different products, and there's just so much probably, I don't know, what I perceive as misinformation, honestly, like intentional, just like manipulation through marketing and things like that. And so like I just think it's a great space to really like provide information, to have people come who they can come to, who they trust, about like how do you really feed your skin.
I'll say, so Info Bloom was born in amidst the pandemic, and a big part of that came from one, just on a personal note. Growing up, I didn't grow up in a household where like communication was we weren't great communicators. Um, it was kind of like suppressing your thoughts and your feelings about certain things and just kind of carrying it with you and just moving forward, moving past things. We don't talk about this and, keep quiet about that. And as an adult, I realized how that kind of stunted me in some ways when it came to like my personal relationships and how I show up in the world. And when the pandemic was happening, I kind of saw that reflected in a lot of people, honestly, and thought that this would be a great opportunity for us to bring people together versus how in that moment the pandemic felt like it was like ripping us apart, wanting to find a way to empathize with people and connect, because we, like Tia always says, we are our greatest resource. And I genuinely believe that.
So growing up, a lot of my ambitions centered around kind of three things. It was either psychology and mental health, um, there was always like a service orientation and writing. And so those are the three things that I was always really excited about. And any of my ambitions kind of were aligned with those things. I ended up going to undergrad for psychology and got a psychology degree. And I think that in part stemmed from I always kind of attracted as far as like friends or people who felt comfortable coming to me, a lot of people who were struggling mentally. And I didn't grow up having severe mental health issues at all. But there was like something that I really connected with. I also connected with people who I thought other people would view as like the worst of society, the irredeemable, so to speak. There was something also again that I resonated with in those people, and I thought that I kind of had this belief that everyone should feel valuable and everyone's purposeful and worthy. And so I felt like people who were outcasted or whose lifestyles like seemed or were deemed as unacceptable, I really wanted to extend a hand to them in a way that I felt like most people wouldn't. I even wanted to like get into like criminal psychology at one point. Like Asia was saying, we in the midst of the pandemic, we started gathering the idea of doing Info Bloom, and I think I really found that storytelling could be a means of empowering people, as a means of connecting with people, a means of finding solutions and addressing some of the concerns that we have as individuals and as a society. But I also think that I from 2019 on, I started to feel very like I was talking about with you all at a different time. I started to feel very like, what can I do in this world? How can I contribute in this world? And this has really been a space where I feel like through kind of some of the natural gifts I have and through just the power of connection, like I started to feel like I can't will things to happen. You know what I mean? And I'm a much smaller part than I once felt like I was. Um, and so to me, like again, the power of people meant something to me, and the power of just connection and showing up for other people and hearing people's stories was really powerful to me.
Well, that is all we have for our book 2 intro. We are very, very excited to go ahead and start jumping into this book. So thank you so much, Tri, for joining us. Please stick around again for more information about the charities we are supporting. Right in the description box below, we'll let you know what the chapters we are covering next. But of course, please join us for the next episode. There's always room for you here. Journey well, Tribe.
Hey, Tribe. Before you go, we wanted to chat with you about how you can help your fellow humans navigate collective grief and trauma. This season, each host has chosen a charity to share with you all. The charities we've selected have missions that address collective grief or trauma in some way. Our hope is that you'll find a charity whose mission aligns with your hopes for humanity.
You can check the description box for links to our fundraising pages. We encourage you all to explore the websites for information about each organization's impact and ensure you're making an informed decision when giving. InfoBloom Media has no affiliation with any of these charities or crowdfunding platforms. Thank you all for your consideration.
Journey well.